Okay, hello everyone. Good morning, good afternoon, wherever you are, and welcome back to FormIt Friday. And this is Tom, and I have Tobias with me.
Good morning, Tom. Good morning, everybody.
And we took a little bit of a break over the summer. Um, the FormIt Friday took a break, and we took a break. But we decided that summer isn't over just yet. It's starting to get a little cool here in Boston, anyway. I don't know about out there in Colorado, but
A little. It's cooling off a little.
yeah, that tiny little hint of the summer ending there. But we thought we would come back because we had a couple things over the summer, but mainly we were out at the BiLT conference, formerly known as RTC in Toronto, just earlier this month, actually. And Tobias gave a great lab. You were actually pretty busy. You did a lab and a presentation, right?
Yeah, with Kimberly Furman. It was great. The presentation with Kimberly was an introduction and overview for FormIt, and then the lab was kind of a deep dive on content creation and moving stuff over to Revit.
Yeah, and I got to stand in the back and be a lab assistant, which was fun. Very,
Yeah, thank you for that. It's
relatively
awesome.
low pressure, but it was great as always to get out and see people at these conferences and meet customers and just such a great energy at Built, which I think you're gonna kind of give a little overview of. Yeah, so with that, I'm just gonna hand it over to Tobias and take it away.
Great. Yeah, so this will be a recap of the lab that I taught at BiLT, and Tom was the perfect assistant for. But before jumping into it, I wanted to give a quick sort of recap on what BiLT is for those who don't know or have never been. This was BiLT North America, so it was in Toronto, Canada this year. And there's BiLT conferences all over the world. There's one upcoming in Europe and then another one in Asia. That's the first one next year, I believe, in April. Then there will be another BiLT NA in St. Louis next year. So put that on your calendar for next summer. The conference is not huge. It ends up being about 600, 650 people once you include the vendors on the show floor. And this isn't everybody that was at the conference, but you do get a sense that it's a lot smaller than AU, a lot more focused on AEC. And it used to be laser focused on Revit, and now they're starting to broaden the perspective a little bit. So it's not just Revit, it's other softwares as well, including stuff like FormIt and Dynamo, of course, but even things outside of Autodesk are presented and discussed. So I just wanted to give a quick highlight of some of the people. Really, the small attendance makes it awesome you get to connect with some great people. So here's Carl Storms. We've had him on FormIt Friday a few times, recapping some of his work. And he wrote a great recap of BiLT NA this year, which I'd highly recommend. His website, the BIM Cider, he covers a ton of topics, but wrote a great summary that this short one here won't do justice to. And he's a great educator, taught several classes. This is a good one too. This is Ian Siegel from formerly of KPF, who presented an intro to Dynamo, and he's teaching, he's put together Lynda courses that are available. Great introductions, very basic, step-by-step, teaching the fundamentals of Dynamo for people. Autodesk was there in attendance, and this is Sasha, one of the PMs for Revit, and she was talking about the future of buildings from Autodesk point of view. And the Revit team had a couple of really neat exercises. One was buy a feature. So given a certain budget, what new features for Revit would you fund? So this was a great sticky exercise that got people at our booth to interact with everyone. And that was guided by our friend Heather Leck in the red jacket there, interviewing customers, kind of getting feedback, and then throwing dots up. You can see this one, it's getting a lot of votes, so obviously pretty popular. This guy too over here. So that sort of feedback gets funneled back to the Revit development team and informs the new features that they work on and the small enhancements that they add. Heather also led a class on designing a feature for Revit. And this is really neat to just put together a poster, kind of a concept poster for a new feature, and illustrate a couple of things, talk about who the user is, who the customer would be, and what problem that feature would solve. So kind of an exercise in why does this feature matter, and why should the Revit team care about it. BiLT NA is also known for being kind of on the front end of a couple of different technologies. So here's Tom testing out the HoloLens. That one of our friends was demoing it from Synchro, and there's some pretty neat features there. Tom, did you have something to add?
Yeah, no, that was like the second time I think I ever used a HoloLens, and you know, it really doesn't fail to impress. But it was really cool to see a very specific building use case where they actually had the 4D sort of construction. The structure would sort of build as you went through this kind of the time scrubber, and it was really impressive.
Yeah, that's pretty
fun.
cool. And this is Colin McCrone. He was the Dynamo evangelist for Autodesk, and he's actually joining Autodesk again in September. And he's on a crazy bike ride across the country, but he made time during his crazy bike ride to attend the BiLT NA conference and presented a Dynamo workshop, which was a lot of fun. And here's Anthony talking about other things going on at Autodesk, like Project Quantum. So this is myself and Kimberly Furman. Like I said, we did an overview for FormIt and took a bunch of questions, had a really interactive discussion about what FormIt was. This is a friend, Brian Mackey, also known as the Revit Geek on Twitter. And he had a couple of awesome Revit classes, one on global parameters and another one on using Revit journals as macros to script repeatable behavior that you wanted. So check those out if you get the chance in the future. And here's me presenting the lab that we're going to get into here in just a second, and that Tom helped out with. So the labs at BiLT are great. They're virtual machines, so everybody's looking at the same setup, really helps with standardization. There's probably 20 people that get these virtual machines, and then there's another 20 people that sit at the gallery, basically auditing the class. They can bring their own computers and follow along. So that's what we'll get into now is that lab about content creation. So a few things. Here's me and my little family. I was an architect for 5 years and practiced in Kansas City at BNIM, and then got licensed and joined Autodesk, where I've been for 10, almost 11 years now. Here's my Twitter handle, and I love Tetris. Followers of FormIt Friday probably already know that. A few sort of getting started preamble items. Grab the datasets folder that we will post onto our FormIt website. We'll throw that onto the blog post with this recording and with the announcement. But that's the same dataset folder that we used in the BiLT lab, so it'll be helpful to follow along. We're using FormIt for Windows, not FormIt for the web or FormIt for iOS. We're going to use Revit 2018, and we're going to use version 1.9.4 of the FormIt add-in. That's key because that's where the material transfer technique works. It only works with Revit 2018, and it only works with that newer version of the add-in. So do a double check on your system and make sure you don't have 1.9.3 installed, because you will miss out on that. Yeah, and the material conversion only works with Revit 2018, not Revit 2017. So just to set up why this matters, the content library in FormIt is huge and helpful because it's a preemptive way for BIM managers and for you as a customer to standardize and create high quality reusable content. Stuff that's popular on projects can get pulled out and put into the content library and reused in future projects. And also you can get a fast start on your projects with the concept of seed files, things that you know you're going to be using. So you just kind of store them in the content library and drag them into a new file as soon as you need them to give you a jump start into a project. Quality control is huge, and scalability goes hand in hand with that. If you've got content that's been made poorly, then you're going to suffer the consequences of that on your projects. So the content library is a great way to standardize, get high quality stuff that's not going to slow down your performance of your file. So basically what we're going to do, I'm going to walk through a couple of slides of what we're going to do, and then we're going to do it, and then we're going to jump back into the PowerPoint and go into stage 2. So we're going to hit 2 early examples, the seed file example with a material library. We get this question all the time with FormIt. How do I sync to a material library? How do I get started with a bunch of materials? So I'll give a quick overview of that. And then we'll do another example of why would I use the content library for these pretty cool little program blocks that you can just drag and drop, do blocking and stacking and massing exercises all at once using FormIt's levels and area tools. And then we'll come back and look at this example of how do I pull building content off of a design model and turn it into content that I can then port over to Revit as a Revit family. So we'll break out a PowerPoint and go right into Revit. Right into FormIt at this point. So I'm in FormIt for Windows, and I haven't associated a content library at this point, so I'm going to do that first so everybody can see how to do it. But all I did was log into FormIt. I'm FormIt Pro customer, and so this is a blank file. And the content library tab is this one down here on the right. It looks like the same icon from Revit, and we did that intentionally. So when you click it, click this plus button up at the top in order to link a content library. And I've got this already downloaded locally on my machine on the desktop in a folder called FormIt Friday and in a folder called Datasets. And this Datasets folder is the same one that you'll download from our website as you go along. And the FormIt content folder is what I want to link to. So I just get to that path on my desktop and click OK. And then in this dropdown, I can tell the content library to look into that folder. And that shows me all the subfolders with my various content in it. And we're not going to go into furniture too much, but this is a great example of why you'd use the content library. You get a little thumbnail preview. You've got the furniture. It's in alphabetical order, and you can drag and drop this over into your scene. You've also got this nice arrow here that'll pop you back up one level. And we're going to look into the materials folder. And we've got one item in there, and it's called the material library. And if you jump over to the materials tab, you can see that it is blank. There are no materials in this sketch right now. I'll click back to the content library, click once, click into the scene again to place the content library. And now I've got this chunk of geometry with a bunch of materials on it, and all those materials have been imported into the library. What's cool about this is if I click the geometry I imported and hit delete, the geometry goes away, I've got a clean file, and I've still got all these materials over here. So that's the seed file concept. I don't need to store that chunk of geometry anymore. I've got the materials seed file ready to go. You can add on to this over time in order, as you find favorite materials and stuff like that. So what I'll hit on quickly for those who are new is how materials work in FormIt. You see the little preview over here, so you can see if it's a textured material or if it's just the color. I'll click the thumbnail preview to enter the paintbrush tool and then single click on the face, and it's going to paint just that face. If I click on the preview over here in the panel again, and then double click on the cube, it's going to paint the entire object. So every face now is painted with that material, and it overrides the material that was there before. If I scroll up to the very top, you can see we've got this material called default, and that works the same way. If I click the preview, I can click one face to remove that material, or double click the whole object to remove all the material from it. Now that's painting an object that hasn't been grouped. With groups, you have one more cool option. If I double click to select this, I'll right click and access the context menu, and then click the create group button, do a Control C and a Control V. And now these two objects are related. If I edit one of them by double clicking and going into its group, I can drag it out and they're both going to update. But what's great is that I can paint one of these by single clicking the material and then single clicking on the group. And then I can single click a different material and paint that onto the other group. And that way you can have related objects that actually have their own materials. So there's a little bit more nuance to it, but that's materials in a nutshell. And that's the materials seed file exercise in a nutshell. So in the interest of time, I'm going to go on and show you the program cubes exercise. And this one also uses the content library. We'll pop out one level, and there's a folder here called Program Cubes. And if you jump into this folder, you can see a bunch of similarly shaped materials that have pretty colors on them, and they've got the name of what that program cube represents. So I'll just go ahead and grab the parking cube, since we all know parking drives a lot of projects. One thing to note is that my placement point for this cube is one of the corners. I set that up intentionally, and I'll show you how to do that in a minute. But you can also see that the program cube is quite a bit larger than the scale of the camera that I'm at. So I can zoom out or do zoom all as I'm placing. You can do your orbiting and things like that as you're placing. Then I'll drop that right there at the origin point, and then do a zoom all so I can see it. And what I placed is this cube that has this material already applied to it, and it's wrapped up in a group. So people who have been following FormIt for a while know that we have this concept of levels, and that you can put levels onto an object and then get area from that object. And that's kind of what this exercise is intended to do. After I place this parking cube, I can select it, go to the Properties panel, and check this button to use levels. And it paints on these blue level lines and shows me how much area is on each of those levels, as well as the total for this object that I've selected. And if I clear the selection, you can see on the Properties panel, it's showing me how much area is in the entire sketch. So it's adding up everything together. And once you place this cube, you can edit it by clicking a face, dragging it out. You can also sketch on it. So I can draw here, use the level lines as a snap candidate, and then click that face and push it off, because I know I only want to have 2 levels of parking. I can continue to adjust this and then click off into space. And I've got my parking cube, and the area is all updated with it. One thing that's neat about the content library that I want to make sure I point out is that it remembers the original shape of the cube. So you can think about this as your library offline, and it's not synced back to this object. So when I place this next cube, you can see it remembers that it was a cube. It doesn't come in like this one. So right now, these are not associated at all. But if I place a second cube here, what FormIt does is it searches through the model and discovers if there is another one that is the exact same, and it will associate those two together. So that way you can have relationships if you want, but if you don't want that relationship, you can edit it and it'll stay independent, or you can select one of them, right click, and choose the group icon with the asterisk on it, and that will make this one unique from the other one. So I'll drag that one back to show that those can be separate. So at this point, you can go ahead and elaborate your blocking and stacking diagram however you want. Drop in additional objects like this residential cube, and perhaps maybe an atrium. This could have a pretty dramatic atrium right in the middle. Maybe between 2 residential cubes. Oops. Yeah, and if you place something in the wrong spot, then you can use FormIt's other move tools to get things back to where you want them to be. You can continue to drag things and snap them. And I'll go ahead and drop an office cube onto the back of this for a neat multi-use building. A lot of office space. And then I'll go ahead and hit UL to say use levels on these different objects. That's the keyboard shortcut for use levels. And you can add additional levels. You can see that those guys don't have the levels on them. So I can just hit add 1 and add 2, and it automatically applied them onto that office cube. So that's just blocking and stacking and using the content library. What I want to do real quick is give you a preview of these materials transferring over to Revit. So I'll click Save Sketch and Save Locally. And I'll pop onto my desktop to that FormIt Friday folder, and I'll call this one Programming. And then I'll jump over to Revit, start a new file, Go ahead, Tom.
Oh yeah, so there was just while you're showing the saving, there's one question which is like, where can we have access to the data set? So we're gonna, you may have referenced this before. We're gonna send out, we'll post those on our website, and we'll send out a link with the video of this early next week. And there was one other question: is the text in the material coordinated with the height of the levels? So I think, then the answer is no. But
yeah, it's not associated with it. I made it ahead of time, but one thing that's neat, we'll look in the materials tab and you can see those materials. If you double click on one of these preview icons, you can get the definition of that material. So the color is an overlay, so you can adjust that. And then the text is just the texture file that I put on it. And you can control the scale here in the material. So right now I have it set at 12 feet because that's the floor to floor height, but you could change that to 10 feet and it'll adjust too. So yeah, not directly associated, but you can update it on the fly.
Yeah, that's how you made it look so nice and neat.
Exactly. Yeah, so just jumping into this for people, it might be their first time using the FormIt to Revit converter. This is an add-in for Revit. Like I mentioned, it's the latest one, 1.9.4. You click the drop-down and choose Import FormIt to Revit, and you just choose that file we created just now. Go to my desktop, FormIt Friday, and that programming file. It's an AXM file. That's FormIt's native file format. And what that does is import the geometry. And since those were just regular groups that I had made, the default for them, default category for them in Revit, it's going to be a mass category. And that's where they just imported. One other thing to point out, when I placed that initial cube, if you remember, I placed it right at the origin of the FormIt file where the red, blue, and green axes overlapped, the 0, 0, 0 point. And that's the same point where they import into Revit. So if I just click the little light bulb icon down here, you can see that's the hidden category project base point, and that's the axis mundi for the Revit and FormIt relationship when you import. So I'll go ahead and turn that off and just point that out, jump into a 3D view, and you can see our mass geometry came over. If I click over into a realistic visual style, you can see that the material transferred as well. And that's all fine. The cool thing is that since we applied levels to this object, we can now go to the Massing and Site tab, to Floors by Mass Floors, and just do a big window selection and hit Create Floor. And what that'll do is find all of those levels, mass floors, and make actual Revit floors for me, so I don't need to sketch those all out. And if I just do a VG and turn off the mass category, you can see those floors are there. So it's just a really quick way to move from massing, blocking, stacking diagram over here into Revit and get going with your design model. All right, so I'll jump out of that and jump back into the PowerPoint, and we'll talk about the content creation, kind of how you go about pulling stuff off of your design model so that you can use it in a more holistic way. So that's the theme here. The case we just looked at is you've got a blank canvas, you've got a blank file, and you're starting from scratch. That does happen, but it also happens where you inherit a design model that may have a lot of stuff in it. And it may be organized, it may be well set up, but it typically isn't. So what I want to get into is how to go about turning stuff into content. So we've got a FormIt file that we're going to look at. This could just as easily be a complex, elaborate SketchUp design model that you're going to want to move into Revit. And so you want to harvest pieces off of it and use them in a more holistic way as content. So keep that in mind as we look at this. We'll go through two steps when we do this. First is kind of a preparation step where we'll copy the geometry out of the design model and paste it into a new file, a blank file. There's another way to do that called export selected. So we'll look at both of those. and then we'll hit the XYZ origin points, because that's probably the first thing you need to get correct as you're cleaning up design models, as you're cleaning up stuff and making it content. Then we'll actually show a little bit about geometry cleanup, the model cleanup, setting the visual style and the cool camera angle so that you can create an appropriate thumbnail for this stuff and have it look nice in your content library. Then we'll talk about organizing the content a little bit, grouping it, how the grouping works, the naming and categorization convention, and using the groups tree to do that. And then also cleaning it up a bit more, taking some of the metadata off, like the layers and the seams, and purging unused materials so that you can keep it lightweight. And then just talk about testing it and saving it locally into your library, and then move into importing it into Revit. And the Revit import process is great. You move from importing it into a family, into placing it, seeing it in the family, kind of testing it out there, and then placing it into an RVT. People who've used FormIt know that we allow you to choose categories, but we don't allow you to choose a window category. So this is one way to get your FormIt content into Revit as a different family template than what we provide. And then we'll come back into PowerPoint and talk a little bit about some other import content workflows, but this is what we're going to jump into next. So come back over to FormIt, and we will open up a new sketch, and we'll go into the datasets folder, and we'll go to the Courtyard FormIt file. And this is just a sort of multifamily condo project that we've used as a test data set for a while. So that's all this is. This will be available for everybody to use also, just as an example of what you can do with FormIt. You can see the materials. I already got a ton of materials from this file. And what I want to do, hopefully PowerPoint or GoTo will keep up well enough, is just show the scene progression that you can set up as an animation to change out layers so that you can show different design options as a storytelling device when you use the animation between scenes. And you can use the section tool to also incorporate into these different saved scenes and kind of take a tour around your building, showing a potential client or showing your in a design review what some of the different things you're thinking about for the building are. You can also tweak the visual styles pretty heavily. We'll move here from the realistic mode with the materials into the more abstract monotone mode with the ambient shadows turned on. Slice a section in floor plan and then add another section plane to it so we can slice it off that direction. In FormIt, you can have up to 6 section planes, all at any angle you want. So it's a little more powerful than the section box you'll see in Revit, but very similar in concept. You've got 6 sides you can slice off of your building and look into. So we're going to focus on this window here. I stopped the animation, so otherwise it would continue to play in a loop. And what we're going to do is just select it and copy it onto our clipboard. So Control-C. And we'll get to pasting it into a file in just a minute. But before I paste it, I want to show you this export selected, because that's the other method of kind of transferring geometry from one FormIt file into another one. I'll do Control-E, which will bring up the export dialog, E for export. And this radio button along the top, by default, it's going to export all objects, but you can also export the visible objects if you've got layers turned off. You can also export just the selected objects if you've got something in particular that you want to work with. So this is huge. It's very helpful working with more granular chunks of geometry rather than your entire model, which will take a long time to process and have larger file size and things like that. So in my FormIt Friday folder, I'll go ahead and save this guy as box window. And I'll save that there. So all I'm doing is exporting just that chunk of geometry. And what we'll do is make a new file. and we'll leave this larger design file because we're not going to work with that one right now. And what I'll show you is that if you do a Control V at this point, so we're pasting from our clipboard, I'll have the window itself on my cursor, and you can see the placement point is at the bottom center of the face. And we'll talk about that in just a moment, but it's the same concept of this XYZ axis. It's just for this group, its origin point is the bottom center face. So I can click and place that wherever I want. You can also do a Control Shift V, which will paste this aligned to where it was in the other model. And that can be great if you wanted this to appear in a very specific place relative to the model that you were working in. But in this case, we don't want that because it's up here out in space. And what we want to do is create just a chunk of content that we're going to control and work with. So go ahead and delete that. I'll also show you the same thing happens if you do import 3D model and you choose that selected object that we exported. If I just import it on its own, you can see it comes in that same spot. So export selected keeps the relative location of the object. So for our purposes, doing just the Control V from your clipboard is the best circumstance because it gets us, we can place it where we want, and we were able to place it at the 0, 0, 0 point of this sketch. All right, and that's what I want to hit on next is the 0, 0, 0 point. We're going to be importing this into a Revit family in a moment. And just like in the Revit RVT file, it's going to import at that same 0, 0, 0 coordinate of the family. So we want to have this thing centered on that spot when we move it in. So it's important to set that at 0, 0, 0. And we've got that here outside for the overall sketch. But what I'll do is double click to go inside of this object. And you can see I've got another smaller XYZ object here. And it's neat in FormIt that I can right click off in space and choose this icon to set the axis. I can also hit SZ to set the Z axis. And now I've got a widget on my mouse. And I can choose to have the placement point for this object be off here on the corner, which might be more relevant for me as the inside face of this object, or I guess, sorry, that's reverse. That's the outside face of this window or the inside face of this window. So you can kind of choose where you want the placement point to be for the object as far as FormIt is concerned versus where the import location for this object will be when you go into Revit. So when I'm inside the group, I'm setting the placement point for the object in FormIt, and when I'm outside the group, I've got the origin point for Revit import. Hopefully that makes sense, but it's really powerful. You can test that out just by selecting it, doing a Control C and a Control V, and you can see the placement point is already updated to be that back corner. And that's great. When you place from the content library, it will also use that same point. All right, so that's the XYZ origin. Now we'll do a little bit of model cleanup just to make sure that what we're working with is nice. And the tools for that are under the visual styles icon and then the diagnostic set of tools. That's the wrench there. If you check on identify watertight issues, identify back faces, and you can even show group bounding box if that's helpful. But basically this will show you any edges that are stray edges or faces that aren't connected and backside of faces. So if I've got geometry that's kind of ugly and unnecessary and unhelpful when I'm moving into Revit, that will be highlighted to me with red when I'm in display watertight mode and identify back faces. So it's a really key first step when you're working with stuff off of the design model is to clean it up. And what we're going to do now is set the visual style for our thumbnail preview. And I like to turn those off for the preview, probably because it's not helpful to see that in case you have any. So just make sure to uncheck those. But the rest of the visual styles you want to check are these first three tabs over here. So having shadows on can be very helpful to kind of ground the object. Ambient shadows on or off, up to you. Does give you a nice effect, but it also darkens it a little bit. You can go to monotone surfaces if you'd like to. If the materiality isn't important, it might kind of jump out a little bit more. But for this guy, obviously the wood is pretty important, so I want to leave that. You can go into the edges and turn off edges if you don't want to see those, if you just want to see the textured surfaces. You can also dial up and down the edges to give them more contrast or less. This is one of my favorite features in FormIt, so I show it anytime I can. You can thicken the outside edges if you want that more cartoonish, stylized look, or you can bring your silhouette edges all the way down to give you a more pencil, kind of fine mechanical pencil style. You can also turn on sketchy edges and hidden edges and extended edges and things like that, if that's the sort of look that you're going for, but I'm gonna leave this pretty clean like this. I'll also actually turn off silhouettes because that is a performance issue. If you have a lot of silhouettes, especially on a curved object, it can be slow down your performance. I also like to turn off these environment effects for the snapshot. So things like the grid, I want to turn off. The axes, I want to turn off. And if I had the north arrow on, I would also turn that off, because that just adds a little bit of extra stuff into the thumbnail preview, which you probably don't want. And if you had levels turned on, you might want to turn those off too, because otherwise you'll have those blue lines on your geometry. So now you set up the camera angle that you're interested in. So you can do a ZA and get kind of an overall look. You can orbit around and get a different look if you want. But something like this, so you can see the object in 3 dimensions, you can see the shadow on the ground. Right around there is basically where I like to set this up. And now I'll go ahead and do a quick save into the content library so we can see how the thumbnail preview looks. And we can also test what this will look like when we place it. So I'll do a Control S. I'm actually not going to do yes, I am going to do a Control S because I pasted this into a new file, so we haven't saved it yet. So it's going to be looking for a name for this content also. And what I'll do is I'll jump into our dataset folder. I'll jump into the FormIt content folder, and I have a file already here called Windows, a folder called Windows. You can make a new folder on the fly if you wanted to. And this is where you can drop in your window. I'll call this one box window. Actually, I'll give it a space, no underscore. So we'll call it box window, and we'll save it. Now if I go to look in my content library, and I'll jump into that Windows folder, I can see I've got the file I just created, box window, and window 1 is already there from a previous exercise. You can't delete those from here, but you can delete them in Windows Explorer, and then they'll just go away from your content library. You can see our thumbnail here is the same as the thumbnail we're looking at here. So that's why you'd spend the time to set up the visual style and the camera angle you want. It did zoom out on me just a little bit, did an automatic zoom when I did the save. So I'm going to just zoom back in a little bit and do another Control S. And it didn't do a zoom the second time. I think the first time it does the save, it does a zoom all. The thumbnail did not update right away. What I need to do is leave the folder and then jump back into it, and it'll update with a new thumbnail. So that's nice that you can kind of test that out really quickly on the fly without having to jump out to Explorer. I'll zoom out a little bit and then test placing this guy. And it's looking pretty good. What we realized is that when we were placing it, it did not have the same placement point as what I expected. And I remember why that is. That's because we've got a layer assigned to this object. This object is on the layer window frame 1, which I inherited that information, that metadata, from the previous model. And you need to remove that information from your content. That's part of the cleanup process that we're going to get into next. So what we'll do is look at the groups tree. This is a super handy feature in FormIt, and I like to point it out to everyone. This is model management at its best, that when I look here at the main sketch, that's my overall model, I have a chunk of content in it, a group called window frame 1, and inside of it is something called window glass. And you can see when I click on it, it also highlights in the canvas, and that is great for identifying what you're working with and renaming it and working with it. So I'm going to rename this from window frame 1 to box window, and all I had to do was double click in the field and it updated. You can see that the category is also assigned here. If I click that drop down, I can change it to mass, category, casework, entourage, furniture, etc. Generic model is fine. I'm going to leave it as generic model and then click window glass. You can see it inherits the generic model category. I can't have a nested group of a different category. That's a good limitation to have. And I can double click and edit those. I'll just change this so it's called glass layer. And now I've got that sort of model management setup done. I know I'm going to be sending this to Revit, so setting it to generic is important. If I left it as a mass, I would not be able to import that into a window family category. I'll also check, like I mentioned, the scenes to see if I inherited any scenes with this model, and then the layers. I'm going to go ahead and delete that layer so that I don't have any layers when I import this object in the future. I'm not sure why it's not disappearing, but when I select this object, you can see it's set to no layer, so that's better. All right, and oh yes, also it's probably helpful to purge unused materials just to kind of clean this guy up. That's this button here. If I had any materials that were unused, I could click that and it would clean out the stuff that's in there. All right, so at this point I'll do a control. I'll turn off my Z axis again, get the camera angle I want, and do a control S. And then what we'll do is do a new sketch and come over here to the content library and try placing box window. And you can see now the placement point is correct, that back corner. I can place it there. When I select this object, I can check its properties and see that it's called box window. That's what I want. When I look in at the groups tree, I can see that it's the box window group and it's set to generic model, and its nested group is called glass. So that's all pretty much ready for me to go for future use of this object in other FormIt models. And that's cool, but what I want to do with this now is also bring it on into Revit and set up that relationship. So I'll go ahead and do that in the next 5 minutes or so, and if there's time, I'll show you how to kind of place it into a file too. So when you're in Revit, this is Revit 2018 again, and you want to do a new family, you'll get the dialog to choose which template you want to use. So I'll scroll down to the bottom and choose the window template. And this is the hosted window template, so it has the cut object in it already, the piece that slices through the generic wall here. And that's all you get when you start off the template, a few reference planes that we'll work with, and this generic wall. So the cool trick is that the FormIt add-in works in the family environment as well as the RVT environment. So I'll go to the add-ins tab, click import FormIt to Revit, and choose that box window file that we were just working with. I'll click open, and it's going to import it into the family environment. Should be right on top of that, but it didn't, probably because I grabbed the wrong one. Oh, correct, yeah. So I need to go to my datasets folder, to my FormIt content folder, to my Windows folder, and grab that box window that we were saving there. I'll click open, and this should import. There it is. And you can see that it's centered where we were working with that XYZ origin point. So that's why it's important to set that up ahead of time. Otherwise, I'd be moving it around here, and that'd be kind of a drag. So the first thing I like to do once I get this imported is to look in the type properties dialog and get this guy kind of set up, because FormIt imports family type for you when you import your object. And since we did that first import with that didn't show up. There was nothing on it, so I'm going to delete that one. And we're going to work with just the one family type. You can rename this if you want, of course, box window, and start to set the type properties here. So the height and the width of the window, I know from FormIt. You can also take measurements off of it here, but I know that's 9 foot by 9 foot. So I'm going to adjust that, and I can even hit apply here to see that update. You can see the opening in the wall just grew to the size of my box window. I'm going to scroll down, and there's two things that are important here. These visibility parameters, these are very important because they kind of control whether or not the geometry you just imported is visible. So it's a way that you can work with types and hide and show, but it can also be problematic if you don't know that they're here. So I'm going to grab that type 2 from our first import and actually delete that parameter because I don't want it. And then have my family type 4 visible. That's fine. I don't need to rename it, but I just want to make sure that it's checked. And then I want to change the default sill height in this case. I want it to be 1 foot off the floor by default because it's a very tall box window. So I'll go ahead and set all those, click OK. And what I've got now is my type pretty much set up, but my geometry itself is loose in this family. And so what I want to do is lock it down to the reference planes like any good family editor, content creator would. So I'm going to use the align tool, grab this reference plane over here, and lock that left side onto it. I'm going to grab the center reference plane for this wall and unpin it. And what I want to do, since this is going to be flush with the inside face of the wall, is align it to the inside face of this wall. Align that reference plane, that is, and then lock that reference plane to the inside face of the wall. And you can test this part out just by flexing the default wall type that's here. People who have built window families, you guys probably know all about this, but just for everybody's sake, now that reference plane is tied to the inside face of the wall, and I want to tie my geometry onto that reference plane. So I'll again do align, grab the reference plane first, use the tab key to find it, and then lock my geometry onto it. And now when I flex that wall, I can go back to a generic 8-inch type. The geometry itself is going to stay aligned. That's what I want. And I'll also go to the left view because right now I need to, there's where that other window family is. So I'll delete that. That was the one that was off in space, illustrating the point of why it's valuable to move this to the origin. And what I'm going to do is lock my side view so that it's also on the reference plane at the default sill height. So I'll do align, grab that guy, and lock it down. And now I've got my geometry appropriately locked onto the reference planes. And this is really important. I'll show you why in just a moment. But let me go to a 3D view and turn on realistic materials. And you can see that that wood material we had established and the glazing transparency is imported with our content. So this is really neat. It's one of the first times we've seen materials import between SketchUp and Revit if you're going from SketchUp to FormIt to Revit. But FormIt materials also come across from FormIt into Revit. So it can be really handy if you've got these custom elements that you don't need to be parametric in Revit because they're so custom and they're coming off the design model. You can build up your content in Revit very quickly using this method. So what I want to show you quickly is if you were to tweak this design, if this content changed, then you can, since you spent some time setting that up with reference planes, you can update it very quickly. So I'm going to go into my FormIt content folder, into the Windows folder, and then open up that box window. So this is the file we're working with. And let's imagine that the window is too thick and it actually moves back, needs to move back by 6 inches. So we do that change in FormIt. We do a Control-S to save that file again, and we go back to Revit. We'll go back to our floor plan view, and we can go to the Add-ins tab and import that latest change. I'll grab the box window file and import it. And you should see it show up relative to the origin, like before. It is a little bit shorter. You can see that just visually by dragging it on top of the other one. What we'll do is delete this, because now we just did an import, so we can select this previous one and swap it out for the other one that we just imported. So I think this one will be the window 2. I'll choose that one, and you can see that it got shorter, but it also remains where it should remain. And if I look at it in 3D view again, yep, it's still aligned in the right height, right width, and everything like that. So I'm much happier with that. Able to update that on the fly very quickly just by swapping the type. And I'll also check my types dialog one more time to make sure that I've got the one that I want. So in this case, I'm going to delete the family type 6 that we just imported, make sure I've got the type set up the way that I want, and then come down here and make sure that the family type parameter is set up correctly for visibility. I'll go ahead and click OK in this case, and now what I want to do is save it and then load it into a project. So I'll do a save. I'll pop up and save this in my desktop FormIt Friday folder and just call this box window. You would probably want to save this where your RFA is going to be in the future, and I'm going to load this into a project. And we've already got I've already got a project open. In this case, it's this this condo file that I've imported. It's a linked file, so I'm not able to drop it into a wall, but you can see it's already showing up here as a window. So what I'll do is go to Architecture tab, go to the Wall tool, and draw this wall on here, and then go to the Window tool, and that's my box window. I'll go ahead and place that into the wall there in my project. I'll jump into the 3D view for this so we can see it in 3D. This is now regular Revit content. I'll look at it in realistic visual style. You can select it and hit the space bar, you know, in order to flip it so it looks in the opposite direction. And it's great because now it's actually cutting that wall like you would expect a window to do, rather than just kind of floating in there like imported content on its own would. So I'm running out of time, and I'm not going to be able to hit on everything that I wanted to, but I do want to just point out with this file that's in the background, this is the overall file that I imported from FormIt into an RVT, and then I linked into this host file. And this is super helpful because you can do this neat trick of tabbing into the linked file and grabbing a specific element that you want, do a Control-C, and then do a modify, paste, align to same place, and we'll drop that element in. I'll go ahead and hide the linked file so that you can see the mass geometry that's under it. I think I'm going to hide the linked file. There we go. And so this was a piece of geometry that I was able to pull off. So now I can do wall by face on this element, and then put my window actually into that real wall, and I can start to build up my design model that way also. So I won't have enough time to go into all the detail for that, but that's a workflow that is totally viable, I think, and helpful as you're moving from design to development model in Revit. So Tom, I don't know if there's any questions you want to hit on in the last few seconds, or I should jump into the PowerPoint and just hit on these slides.
Yeah, and I answered a couple of questions in the answer pane, and yeah, like we said, we'll have this content available, and you can go through it at your own pace. And then this will be great stuff to kind of show to your colleagues in the office, and because I think a lot of this stuff is just really, really relevant and useful. I love the the window cutting the hole in the wall. It's just it's great.
Yeah, it's pretty cool. You can do that with a bunch of stuff too. Doors is another good example for stuff that you want to bring in. This is just a quick slide showing the SketchUp workflow. So on the left is some stuff I got from the SketchUp warehouse, and then importing to FormIt. That you can see it's incredibly high fidelity. You get the materials, the geometry, and other things like that. you can now pop that into Revit also, and you'll get the materials that come across. So you've got furniture, things like that, that you can pull off the SketchUp warehouse into Revit. You get these kind of nasty facets on them. I think you can see those. Nothing we can do about that. They are real facets in the geometry, so Revit displays those. But what's nice is if you go into, this is the realistic render or the ray trace rendering in Revit, or the live VR experience or live rendering or other rendering tools that are in Revit, those edges will disappear. So you can start to do VR and other sort of high fidelity presentations very quickly with this content if that's what you needed to generate and you needed to pull it off of a design model. So pretty handy. And I do want to give, this is one for moving the opposite direction, just SAT files going over to FormIt out of Revit. That is possible to do. You don't get the material in that case, but you do get the geometry as a reference. And last but not least is Dynamo and all the cool things you can do with Dynamo Studio in FormIt. Whole building geometry like this, parking garages that show up in FormIt and can be flexed. The Dynamo geometry can be flexed. Repeating element examples like louvers, column grids, panels and curtain walls, and also hooking up with Fractal too. So things that come out of Dynamo Studio can go through Fractal for generative design.
Excellent. And we've covered a lot of these in the past. So I just pasted in the chat window a link to our YouTube channel where we have a playlist for all of the previous FormIt Fridays. And this one will be posted up there probably by Monday. And yeah, thank you, Tobias. This is really great. I know you had to kind of compress a longer lab into a shorter time. So
yeah,
but you did a great job. And yeah, I know a lot of this kind of went by fast, but like I said, we'll have all the content ready for you for early next week to kind of take out to your colleagues and really kind of start. We really want to hear back from you about how you've been able to integrate some of this into real workflows. So, you know, you can find us on Twitter. Also, the FormIt forum you can get to from our website, which is our official Autodesk answer forum. You can ask questions there, and there's also an idea station for ideas. So plenty of opportunities to reach out to us. And stay tuned. We're going to be kind of rethinking how we approach these webinars in the future. We really want to expand the conversation to broader topics such as how we work with data and generative design topics. So we're going to stay tuned. We're going to be kind of rethinking and broadening the audience and some of the speakers as well for this webinar. So it should be pretty exciting this fall as we start to explore some new topics. So thank you everyone for joining us today. Thank you, Tobias. This was great. And
thank you.
Have a wonderful weekend, and we'll see you guys online.
Bye, everyone.